Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on another episode of the Cultured Nerd Podcast. Today, we're going to actually talk about the heartbreaking news over the weekend that actor Jason David Frank had passed away unexpectedly at the age of 49 in his home. He was most notably a Power Ranger for the greater career, movies and TV. Everyone who knew the medium understood who he was and loved him for what he did. So we're going to talk about him and the impact that he had on each of us as 90s kids growing up. He was the Power Ranger for us. So thank you for tuning in, and let's get to it. How's it going, buddy?
I like the way that you put that. He was the Power Ranger. There were a bunch of Power Rangers, right? They were a team. He was the new kid. He was the outsider. The Green Ranger stood out. I mean, he was instantly my favorite Ranger the moment he showed up on screen.
Yeah. And it was interesting because he did show up in season 1 of the show. Like, he was kind of there from the get-go. He wasn't on the first episode, wasn't on the second, fourth, fifth, or in the first dozen probably, but it was kind of how they wrapped up that first season where they introduced Rita had this other coin, this weapon that she had been hanging on to. And she essentially said, I'm going to make a Power Ranger of my own and I'm going to mess with them. And they introduced Tommy earlier that same episode as just like the new kid, the new transfer kid. And he kind of like meshed well with the kids and everything was good. And then all of a sudden, the Green Ranger attacks and holy crap, it's Tommy, the guy we just met. And from there, from like that moment on, he was like, people loved him. And during those days of Power Rangers, they were taking a lot of footage from the Super Sentai Japanese series. And the Green Ranger was not a major staple of that show. He was a reoccurring character. He was a reoccurring character, but he wasn't as big as the American show made him. So that's why when they did these random edits, they had scenes where he was fighting by himself without the team, or he was doing this. And then they had this whole arc later in the show that he was losing his power to justify why he wasn't fighting with the team anymore. Like, he was such a popular character that they made more time for him than they actually had footage for.
Wow. It's so funny. It feels like there was so much footage, but you're right. There isn't really. And even the stuff, you see the same shots over and over again, right? Yeah. There's that one shot with the town in the background, and that's always the one shot for the Zord.
Yeah. And they audiences loved them. I remember when I was a kid, I think the show came out in 93, about the same time as the Batman animated show, which is kind of like just right when we were little kids. And I remember when we were kids, it was Halloween at school, and everyone was dressed up as Power Rangers, but nobody was a Green Ranger because they didn't have costumes for him, except for my one friend whose mom painstakingly made him a costume.
Whoa, and he had a Green Ranger costume.
He did. It was all handmade. It was wonderful. Obviously, he didn't have a helmet because in the 90s, unless you're using paper mache, you're just going to not get a helmet. But he was such a cultural impact from us at an early age, from like 6, 7 years old. Like, he was there.
Did you ever see the Power Rangers in person during the 90s?
Not in person, no. During the 90s, I remember when the Power Rangers first came out. Remember that first Christmas right after the initial launch of the Power Rangers, and how there was like lines out the door. There was every toy store was sold out. It was like that scene in that movie Jingle All the Way when everyone wanted a Turbo Man. Everyone wanted a Power Ranger. And
Turbo Man looks very much like a Power Ranger as well.
And that was the riff on it. That movie was actually riffing on the Power Ranger phenomenon of the 90s. But they did live shows, did all the stuff. And then when Tommy came in, I remember his figure was probably one of the hardest ones to get because you didn't buy it solo. Like, the other figures was like $20 and you get the single Power Ranger, the tall, like it was like 10 or 11 inches, the big figures. And then if you wanted the Green Ranger figure, you also had to buy like the box set. And the box set for the Green Ranger figure also came with like the power coin for the Morpher set that you got from the first season, but also the dagger too. Like, you had to buy him and his weapons. And it was like $50 or $60 when it first came out. And then you had like the Zord came out separately, and everything around him was harder to get. So I remember, like, I think I had one friend who had that figure, and his parents were just like, it was his birthday. We made it work. And it was such a hard thing to get. But as that show go on, he kept coming back, right? I mean, they wrote him out of the show because the Green Ranger was gone, and he said his goodbyes. He had this dynamic with the Amy Jo Johnson's character Kimberly. It was like the love story of our little kid times. And when he disappeared, he was gone, right? Like, just we went like maybe half a season without him, and then Lord Zed shows up. Season 2's under like full on, and they introduced this new White Ranger, right? And so like the original team started to change, right? I mean, you had the Green Ranger there, and eventually by that point you had the Red Ranger, Yellow Ranger, and Black Ranger all getting recasted.
Mhm.
They were in the process of being recasted, right? And they introduced this enigmatic White Ranger, and I honestly, to this day, one of the biggest things about who he was is actually one of the funniest things is that the White Ranger was not from Power Rangers. And that's why, almost the same way, the White Ranger was never actually shown on screen with the other Rangers in the archive footage that they used. It
Wow.
was,
So they just did it all through editing?
yeah, it was all through editing. They basically saw the popularity of Jason David Frank's character, and they were like, we need to give him a new Ranger, and this new Ranger needs to be unique. And it was. I mean, they pulled him out of a second, because the original Power Ranger show was more popular than the Japanese counterpart. So they kept using archive footage. They kept pulling new stories. They kept adapting different things. They eventually even did their own stunt work with their own actors.
And the
then,
Japanese get a new show every year, right? They
Yeah,
do.
one-
It's one
Yeah.
season and done. Even if it's very popular, the next season's going to be another concept.
Exactly. And that wasn't the case with American Power Rangers. Like the original, I think the original Power Rangers that we have, season 1 and 2 and 3 and all that, it was based on, I'm going to say a Koyu Ryu Sentai Zairu Ranger. And that was the original one. And this one, very different than what we got. This Power Ranger show was about this mythical kingdom. These were all essentially knights, and this evil witch was trying to destroy the kingdom, and these knights were given powers to battle.
When you say it like that, it's like, of course, he's the lion. He's the Red Ranger of another show, right?
Yeah.
He has his own sword. It talks to him. That's all magic.
Yeah, so on this show, the one that he came from, the White Ranger came from a different team entirely. This one was
Yeah.
a Kaiyu of the Howling New Star. There's a Super
Yeah.
Sentai separate show. And it was like, it was the show, he was the White Ranger. It was Gosai Sentai Dia Ranger, I think was the name of that show. And obviously they loved his design, and they didn't want to change the costumes of the other Rangers, so they just pulled him out and took every bit of footage that they could find of him fighting alone and meshed it
Wow.
into the other Ranger show.
Great.
And that was
clever. So clever.
But Jason David Frank was the face of Power Rangers. And when they eventually, I mean, the show went from being the Red Ranger as the team leader, the Red Ranger as the team leader, to even when they adapted the movie, they
Yeah.
made him the leader.
Yep.
They put him front and center. And then when they even adapted later seasons with other shows, they pulled other aspects of those shows and kept him as front and center.
Right.
And as that story kind of went on for him, after the Power Rangers wrapped up, they eventually adapted Power Rangers. They created Power Ranger Zeo and made him the Red Ranger of that show. And that was this whole story arc of them losing their powers and needing to go on essentially like a vision quest to find these Zeo crystals. And these crystals would then later give them more power.
I like
as
the
that
star
show-
helmet. I always liked that Red Ranger star helmet. I always thought that was a cool design.
I always thought that was pretty rad too, yeah. And this one really kind of pulled onto this like astrology sign kind of a thing, where like each of the Power Rangers had these like mythical animals. There was like bulls and like unicorns and stuff like that. Like it was very, very unique Power Ranger designs, and all based on like star charts and whatnot. And then as it went on, they eventually adapted Power Ranger Turbo, which that came into theaters first. And this time, unlike the other Power Ranger movie, Turbo was the first movie that was actually canon to the TV show, where the Power Ranger movie was kind of like its own pocket universe where let's tell our own story, and then when the show gets to that point, they'll make their own stuff up, and they did that. But Turbo meant to take place between two different shows. The end of Zeo and the beginning of Turbo, the movie fit right in. And then on that first episode of the Turbo show, they showed like a 5-minute summary of that movie.
The problem with Turbo is it felt like a step backwards from all the cool shit that they've been doing before, and then they were cars. I just
Yeah.
remember Turbo being like, "Oh, you are adapting this from something else." It felt like the first time we were finally catching up with Japan, and
Yeah.
for whatever reason, Turbo did not sit well with me.
It honestly didn't sit well with a lot of fans, and that show, I think by that point, Jason David Frank did kind of give up on the show a little bit. He eventually passed his mantle on to another Ranger, and was gone for 5 or 6 shows. And during that time, he had gotten married. He had a family, had his daughter, and like he focused more on his craft, on being a martial artist. He is known for having just an impressive resume. But they eventually brought him back. Later in one of the other shows, Power Rangers Dino Fury, this show shrunk up things a bit. There was 3 Rangers, and their Zordon character, their mentor, was none other than Jason David Frank. They brought it in continuity, made the character Tommy Oliver, now graduated with his PhD in essentially, he was like a dinosaur hunter, essentially. He was a
dino scientist.
Yeah, like essentially he was Alan Grant from Jurassic Park. He was a paleontologist, and he, with his background of knowing Power Rangers, he knew that there was some power with these crystals he found on one of his digs.
Isn't it crazy that there's a couple of those seasons of Power Rangers that feel like VR Troopers, and it's like, how come you guys just didn't put more energy into that show? Because now it feels like the staple of 3 Rangers is for a ton of the shows, right? Like that's
There was quite a few shows that did the 3 Rangers. And it started off as 3 Rangers, then eventually became 5 or 6. But the first chunk was always just the three people, and he came in as the Black Ranger of that team, and eventually, he finds his own power. He comes in, and he's essentially like the Green Ranger, the White Ranger, like the most powerful, the bonus Ranger of that team. And
that's a great costume as well. He's one of the things is he always has good costumes. Green, white, that costume, those are all really good costumes.
Yeah, and it was let's see. Let me see if I can find. There was one episode later in the show, Master Morpher. That was the term I was looking for. As the shows kind of kept going on, he kept reappearing. They kept having their big crossover episodes, their big like Forever Red or things like that, where they would come in and like, oh, we need all the Power Rangers back, and he would always come back one way or the other. He came back as the Green Ranger, and in that show with the other Rangers, he actually had this like Vision Quest battle where he had to like conquer his past selves before he could become a new Power Ranger. And they kept leaning heavily into his legacy as a Ranger. Later in the more recent seasons, he did come back again. And this was probably marks his final canonical appearance of Tommy. But there was a whole battle that occurred where the villains were essentially ripping apart the universe, and they needed all the help they could get. And he came back finally with this thing called the Master Morpher, and it was this really cool MacGuffin that he had that gave him access to every single power coin he ever used. So this fight occurs with him basically swapping in between costumes and different suits and being each Ranger one by one in this montage of just Power Rangers goodness, right? And it kind of just reminded everyone that he was always the face of Power Rangers.
Really, he really was. And not like he ever started as the dad. He was never the dad character, but he really did become this crazy tent pole to link all of these shows together.
He did. And he was like, I think some people always consider him as like the big brother of the Power Ranger universe. Like he was never the dad, like you said, but he was always there. Like he was the Power Ranger that was just there. Right?
Question about Power Rangers. Do the Power Rangers have powers? Like, I understand the suit part. That part makes sense. But just being in possession of a morpher and a coin, do you also become superhuman?
That was actually something that they brought up in the recent reboot, right? The reboot movie, the 2017 Power Rangers. Oh, and here's another picture of the morpher that he had in that last appearance.
That's pretty fun.
And let me just cycle out of that. In the original show, they never outrightly said it, but that was why it was adapted in the reboot movie, was that the power coins imbue power on the users. Because there was some episodes where like, oh no, the morphers are failing us. Now we can't even fight the putties anymore, right? Like they treated it like the power was also in them. They were essentially superheroes in and out of the power suits. And that was something that was never spoken directly, but it was always inferred throughout all the shows.
Mm.
And I think actually in the Dino Thunder one, that actually was outrightly said, where the three main Rangers, they also got like superpowers as well, like super speed and stuff like that. Like they had powers outside of the costumes.
It's so funny though. The moment though you give them super speed, it's like, oh well, then I also have this power suit. Like that's a very powerful individual.
Yeah, but kind of to his legacy as a character and as the actor who played him, he was always voted the top Ranger. He's always the one that sells out of all the merchandise. Every time Hasbro puts out anything Green Ranger, it sells out quickly. And you can, and just out of curiosity, yesterday when the news broke yesterday morning, I did pop onto Hasbro Pulse, their service where you can buy directly from them to see what was
Did
honestly being offered. Right?
Everything ship out? Did everything sell out? That
everything
day?
With his version of the Green Ranger on it,
gone,
sold out. So you sold out. The other Power Rangers there, sold out. Right? Everything, even this figure, essentially like the Hot Toys figure, it's $100 sold out. And then the Lightning collection sold out. The statue sold out. The 2-packs sold out. And the flute sold out.
Can you play with that flute? Is that a playable flute or is that just a statue flute?
It's got buttons and it makes the sounds and everything. Even his other costumes, like the Lord Draken, sold out. Like everything Tommy related was like a fire sale. Just exploded. And I don't think it's for a second. I don't think it's for people trying to scalp or be like, oh, he passed away, so let's make a profit. These were the fans that wanted to remember him and just blew open the doors. And like I said, he was known as the face of Power Rangers, so much so that when Bat in the Sun Productions kind of came up, they brought him back. And they brought him for all their nerd fights, right? They redesigned and adapted a new version of the Green Ranger that was eventually adapted into official canon. But they did their first Ryu versus the Green Ranger, and that blew up. Everyone loved that one. Everyone was like, holy crap, yeah, Green Ranger all the way.
It blew up so much, Taylor, that in the Mighty Morphin Power fighting game that you can get, they now have Street Fighter characters in that game. Like,
it blew
obviously,
up to the point where they had to license the Street Fighter characters because
it just worked. And if we're talking about that, it's like, I can't believe that Power Rangers haven't sprinkled into more pop culture.
Exactly. Like it's such a daunting and kind of hilarious thing that's like they're such a staple to like the 90s that they are everywhere still.
And it's crazy as well that they didn't just do. Listen, I understand that they ran out of footage. They never even did a cartoon. They never even did a thing where they just voiced themselves and like, here's a standalone season till we get another live action season. Like all of that stuff. Like I understand that Power Rangers has to fit in this mold, but the characters are so fun now. Like what is Netflix? I've heard rumblings of this. What is Netflix going to do?
Netflix is officially doing a Power Rangers show. They are bringing back kind of back to the roots, and it actually is going to be going into full production following this next anniversary season. The 30th anniversary season of Power Rangers essentially is going to bring in this like legacy team, and I think
of which would have been great to have Tommy on that team.
A lot of people kind of assumed he was going to be in there because you had this team that they announced, and it was going to go into production very soon. And with this brand new show, you had essentially the makings of the first, like the main team, right? I wasn't expecting to bring that up, but now that you did.
Well, I'm assuming then Japan did an all-star season. That's why there's footage of all this stuff. They did something with this.
Maybe. I mean, the last few seasons of Power Rangers, they haven't even bothered using the same footage anymore. They just do their own thing.
Mm.
But in this new show, they have it's like a 30th anniversary special that they're doing, and it was kind of assumed, like everyone always assumed, that Tommy was going to show up, and for all we know, he may have actually filmed something and might be there. But
I don't want to get if it does happen that way. What a fabulous surprise! But like, who knows? You know what I mean? Who knows how long this stuff is in production, and their shoot windows for this stuff is always weird.
Yeah. I saved it and I lost it because I wasn't ready for that. But let me. But as it kind of goes, I mean, you have all of these Power Rangers that are always going back to Tommy being front and center, and that was one of the biggest hype moments of the new movie, the 2017 movie, was this moment that we were going to be getting a sequel with the Green Ranger. Like they teased it at the end of the movie. That was what everyone expected to have come. So I don't know what's happening. My computer's fighting me. But either way, aside from that Green Ranger appearance, he also came back and did a Scorpion versus White Ranger. He returned outside of the Power Ranger realm as Bloodshot for their adaptation of the Valiant universe, and was currently working on this new project of theirs called The Legend of the White Dragon, which was kind of their own kind of take on Power Rangers that was done separately from that as well.
Those other two suits look like Halo suits. Those look...
Yeah, it's kind of this futuristic, the world has been destroyed and powered individuals are an issue. So like he's running, but he's also trying to gain this power because there's like this black version of the white suit that's running around and doing stuff. Like there was a crowdfunding campaign, and it was meant to be this really big project. And yeah, so it's still kind of wondering what's happening with this, because it's not out yet.
You know what? It's funny. It's not funny. It's so sad that we've lost this actor because they'll be limited, but we very well could still have his character show up. We could absolutely have Tommy's Green Ranger show up and they go, "Oh my God, you're here too." And he goes, and then he's in the fight. You know what I mean? Like, you don't necessarily, that's, one of the sad things about these suited individuals. There could be anybody in there, but he doesn't necessarily need to be dead in that universe. But I guarantee you that they will kill him off in that universe because you have to explain why he isn't coming back. Man, look at everybody.
So this is the anniversary special that they were doing, and they essentially pulled a different Ranger from kind of different areas. You have Johnny Young Bosch. Not sure who he's playing. He's in blue attire, but also you've got David Yost, the original Blue Ranger, front and center.
I think he's now the Special Ranger. I think
he might be.
I think he's the Special Ranger. I'm so happy they brought back the Blue Ranger. He ran into every problem in the world in the 90s being a gay man in a homophobic time. I'm so happy that he got to come back. Cat's a favorite. I met that nice Red Ranger in the back. He was a very nice young man and answered all of my questions.
Yep, and you've got Karen Ashley. You've got, like I said, Johnny Young Bosch, Catherine Sutherland. And in the show's continuity, Catherine Sutherland's character is actually married to Tommy Oliver. So they were actually... So it goes without saying there's probably going to be a few references to why he's not in this photo. But you got Walter Jones, the original Black Ranger, and then this new girl by the name of Charlie Kirsch. She is actually meant to be playing Trini's daughter in this show. The actress who played Trini had passed away of a car accident in the early 90s. So they're bringing her on as a legacy character to fill that role.
What a better way to have a young Ranger than have a 10-year-old just turn into an adult male every time they transform. Great. She basically looks like it. And when all these people give their power coins away to the next person, she will now be the new de facto leader, which is super fun.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, but, that looks like a new Red Ranger.
Outside of all the Power Rangers, outside of all of that, Jason David Frank, he was actually from Covina, California, back where your family's from, Michael. He lived primarily in Texas. His adult life, his main style of fighting was Toso Kundo, but he was a 8th degree black belt in Shotokan Karate, a black belt in Waido Ryu Karate, black belt in Taekwondo, a black belt in Judo, purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and an Arjun degree of Muay Thai kickboxing. He was known that he was one of the few that could actually do what he said he was. He was
the belts
extremely
are
disciplined person.
the belts are showing a graduation of time, but it's amazing to hear that he not only, was into this stuff and got this television show, he pursued it his whole adult life. I mean, so much knowledge of all of these different art forms, and what a fun thing to have wrapped up inside of a Power Ranger.
Yeah. And aside from all of that, in between all the Power Ranger-ness of the early 2000s, he was an MMA fighter with a spotless record in mixed martial arts and actual pro MMA. He had one match, and it was a total win by submission. In amateur MMA, he had 4 wins, 2 by knockout, 2 by submission, no loses on either one. He has 4 kids aside from all of that, so there is going to be a gaping hole in this family's life. But he was a Power Ranger for everyone outside of that world.
And I got to see him up close as a kid when Fox Morning Kids invaded SeaWorld one of the summers. We went and saw them at a show.
Yeah, I remember you bragging about that a lot of our childhood.
It was a pretty special day for me, Taylor. It was a pretty special day for me.
I remember that. I actually got to meet him once, just a few years ago, actually. I was in Seattle at our local Comic-Con up here, Emerald City Comic-Con. It was funny because you had all these other big people there, right? I remember that day I met I'm drawing a blank. Norman Reedus. I met him that morning. He was a wonderful individual from The Walking Dead.
The Boondock Saints. I know him from
Boondock Saints, Walking Dead, Blade 2, all of those things, right? I met him. He's a very nice guy. I met Johnny Bernthal, very wonderful human being. Robbie Amell. I met just a handful of people that were very, very popular at the time, right? Very, very pronounced people. And in the midst of meeting all these people, I remember I was actually standing there with Johnny Bernthal talking to him. Out walks Jason David Frank, and like the entire center lit up. Everyone is screaming and cheering. It's like he walked out there like he owned that hall. And didn't matter what line you were in, everyone turned their heads, everyone cheered, everyone saw him. And you had people chanting, "Go, go Power Rangers, go Green Ranger, go." Everyone, and he was just the most genuine person. He was there because he loved the fans and they loved him back. And he was very much that person.
Yeah, and he really bridged a lot of fandom. A lot of those, fan films, Ryu versus stuff, he brings it into the world of Power Rangers just by being there and them allowing him to do this stuff. These things could be swapped down, but when you say we have a star of the show, it really allows for them to say yes to these things. And it's been so fun for them saying yes to these things.
Yeah. I mean, he was everywhere. I mean, you had like the Bat in the Sun Productions, the Superpower Beatdown. You saw him play the Green Ranger, the Godzilla versus the Dragon Zord, or Green Ranger versus Ryu, or the White Ranger versus Scorpion. He was there. He also did the voice of his character in almost every video game version of these things. Even the more recent one, the Battle for the Grid, the fighting game that they came out with.
It's really fun. It's really fun.
It was a bit of a train wreck when it first came out, but they fixed every aspect of it, and he reprised his role. He did the voice of Tommy, Green Ranger, and the villain, Lord Draken. And he showed up in...
Who's a great addition to the Power Ranger universe. Lord Draken is a great concept art. I don't know if everyone knows it, but it's a great...
Essentially, what would have happened if Tommy never was redeemed and he was still evil, and not only did he overthrow Rita and Lord Zed, but he also attacked the command center, killed Zordon and all them, absorbed the White Ranger power into him, absorbed all of the other Rangers, and basically made an army of lesser Power Rangers as he overthrew the universe. It was such a cool take on what would have happened if a Power Ranger went rogue, and we got that. I mean, and who else could have pulled it off except for Jason David Frank?
Yeah. I mean, I fear that we've now reached the tipping point in our fandom that this is going to be every month now. Some person from our childhood is going to be passing away. I mean, maybe this is just the 1-2 punch that happened right now, but I just feel like there's a number of these guys that are getting up there in age, especially these voice actors. I mean, it's like, oh boy, it's all par for the course. He was very young. 49 is very young. So it wasn't like this was on our radar or anything like that, but it's like, man, oh boy.
No, it was, unfortunately, it was very unheard of. It was very unexpected, very heartbreaking for everyone. And all day yesterday, everyone was just outpouring love. My feed was, honestly, it was hard to look at because of how many people were just reminiscing. It was I mean, he was the face of Power Rangers. He was the person that everyone connected with. And you had every single actor he essentially had ever interacted with in that medium, all talking about how much they loved him, all talking about how much he meant to them. You had Austin St. John, the original Red Ranger, always once a Ranger, always a Ranger. Amy Jo Johnson, the Pink Ranger, posting her love. You had literally everybody. Dan Moore, the comic artist who readapted the original show, talking about his love for the Power Rangers and what made his comics work was that.
Yeah, funny enough, I was bitching about not having a cartoon. The Power Rangers comic book is really fun and very well done, and it's all of the things like, oh, I wish everything looked like the universe. The comic books, all of those characters super thrive.
So good. And they've adapted some very familiar things. They've changed some things for the better. They've made some really great stuff. And it's just hard because it's kind of going to have this issue going forward, is that whatever Netflix does, whatever their reboot does, you're going to have people wanting some sort of a tribute, some sort of recognition. So there's going to have to be something. It's hard to do anything differently than what he was because of who he was.
Well, maybe this means, maybe this is the fresh start that the Netflix show can start from ground zero and build up a new canon, a new group, and start from there, and maybe not tie it to any of this stuff. It's so funny. They have so many. I want it to be good. It has so many pitfalls, though, and it's always runs into production issues, especially in terms of how much money you put into the show.
Yeah.
I guess I want to see the dinosaur swords again, and I guess you just don't talk about you make it be its own thing.
Yeah, and it's gonna be hard going forward to see what they do.
It's not the end of Power Rangers. That's this doesn't mean, it just means that this wonderful character that got to be in all this stuff, he's not. They got to figure out a way to get him out of this now, and then we'll see what they do.
But I mean, aside from all that, Jason David Frank was a genuine human being inside of these shows and in real life. He is honestly going to be extremely missed because I mean, what else is there? I mean, he had the impact on the Power Rangers franchise as Kevin Conroy did on Batman, right? They're synonymous together. It's hard to it's hard to think of one without the other.
Yeah, and I'm also sad, Kevin Conroy not so much because I don't know, maybe the world of voice acting. I feel bad that he was so right, like the double-edged curse of this was that he was just known for being this person. And I'm so happy that he did fulfill that role and embraced it because it never went away. I mean, even today, it was like, oh boy, I still see opportunities for him.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, he is all over. I mean, he was in Green Ranger in the first season. He was White Ranger in the next season. He was the Red Ranger in Zeo, the Red Ranger in Turbo. He came back for Power Rangers Wild Force, came back for Dino Thunder as a main character, came back for Super Mega Force. He came back for the Power Ranger movie. He was actually a cameo in that movie. He was in Power Ranger Ninja Steel. He was in everything. Like he was the most consistently reoccurring face of the Power Ranger franchise. And everyone who met him knows what kind of person he was and how wonderful he was. So he is going to be missed.
I am happy to know, as sad it is to leave him, I'm glad that we are able to speak about him in this way and that he will be remembered fondly. That he did have a positive, you know what I mean? That for the most part, people enjoyed him at cons and stuff like that. And listen, a lot of people don't survive their fandom. And afterwards, you find out they're pieces of shit. And I'm glad to know that he is our fandom is not rewarded, but that, he was worth it. And I'm real sad to see him go. He was always a wonderful reminder of what Power Rangers could be.
Yeah. He was, like I said, he was the Power Ranger. I mean,
yeah,
in life, his dedication, his drive, everything, he was a constant role model. He always showed people to constantly push themselves, to see the better version of yourself and to aim for that. And that's who he always was. So
the old adage, I'm not a doctor, I just play one on TV. No, he did it. He could really doctor you up. He could beat the shit out of you. He was pretty, he knew it. He knew what to do.
He was not all talk. He was exactly who we all wanted him to be.
Yeah.
And he will be missed. But thank you, everyone, for joining us today as we talked about Jason David Frank and reminisced about what impact he had on our lives. And again, thank you for tuning in.